Hi, my name is Carlton Hudson. I go by the name Network Prodigy. I want to welcome you to episode 1 of How Stuff Works. Now, this episode is going to focus on a technology that makes it possible for us to communicate on the internet. That technology is called DNS. So in this episode, you will learn two things. Number one, what is DNS? And number two, how does DNS work? Should be a lot of fun, so let's hop into it. Now, the perfect example to explain DNS is to use a scenario where you are attempting to access a website on the internet. Let's say you want to visit CNN's website from your computer. Now, in order to access the website, your computer and the CNN web server must be able to communicate with each other. Now, this communication will typically take place over the internet. But in order for this communication to take place, both devices will need an IP address. So your computer will have an IP address, but so will the CNN web server. So here's the fun part. If you want your computer to communicate with the web server to allow you to visit a web page, you need to tell your computer the IP address of the web server. This requires you putting in the IP address of the server into your web browser on your computer, for example, which means you need to know the IP address of the server. So you open up a web browser like Chrome or your phone, you type in the IP address of the web server, and boom, you're at the website. But here's the problem. A lot of people don't know what an IP address is, let alone the IP address of CNN's web server. And CNN probably isn't the only website that you want to visit. You might want to visit Facebook or Google's website. Now you got to know the IP address of their web servers. And trying to remember a bunch of IP addresses is difficult even for the most experienced IT professional. Now, the great thing is that IP addresses aren't the only thing computers can use to identify and communicate with each other over a computer network. See, you can also communicate with computers using their computer names, or what we refer to as their domain names. So to visit the CNN website, I can type in the domain name of the web server, like CNN.com, for example, instead of an IP address. Now, this is great because it's easier to remember a domain name than it is to remember an IP address. See, we can remember CNN.com, Google.com, Facebook.com, for example, and type those into our web browser compared to remembering and typing an IP address. So having the ability to use domain names make it easier for us to visit our favorite websites. So while domain names are great for us, they're not so great for computers. That's because computers don't understand domain names. They only understand IP addresses. So when we type CNN.com into our web browser, for example, our computer isn't going to understand what CNN.com is. And the end result is that it can't communicate with the CNN web server and we can't visit the CNN website. It will only work if we're able to give our computer the IP address instead of a domain name, because that's all that they're going to understand. So that puts us into a pretty big bind, because here's the deal. We want to use domain names because it's easier for us, but computers only understand IP addresses. So the big question then is, how can I type a domain name like Facebook.com into my web browser and not even 1 second goes by before the web page loads and I'm able to see my timeline? Because the only way our computer can communicate with the web server is if it has the IP address. So how is it working with us only using a domain name? Well, let's see. So the minute you open your web browser and you type in CNN.com, for example, which is a domain name, something in the background begins to happen on your computer. Your computer is going to attempt to resolve that domain name into an IP address. The only way that can be done is if your computer knows the IP address that is mapped to that domain name. And that is what DNS, the domain name system, is used for. It's a naming system that computers use to map a domain name to an IP address. So when it sees a domain name, it knows the IP address that is mapped to it, so it knows what IP address to use to communicate with the computer that owns that domain name. Now, the DNS process is pretty simple. Once your computer knows the domain name, it will do what's called a DNS lookup. This is basically the computer looking to see what IP address belongs to the domain in question. The first place it will look is in its local DNS cache, where it maintains a list of DNS entries. If there is an entry for the domain in question, the computer will see the IP address mapped to that domain, and it will then be able to reach out to the computer it wants to communicate using that IP address. Now, oftentimes a computer will check its local DNS cache and won't see an entry for the domain in question. This is when it needs to reach out to a device on the network called the DNS server. Now, the DNS server will contain hundreds and possibly thousands of DNS entries, which will include the domain names and IP addresses mapped to them. So all your computer has to do is ask the DNS server for the IP address of the domain, and if the server has an entry for that domain, it will give your computer the IP address. Now, once your computer has this information, it stores it in its local DNS cache. This way, it doesn't have to keep reaching out to the server every time it needs to resolve that domain name. Now, communicating with the DNS server is really simple. Your computer, which is the end host, will generate what's known as a DNS request. Inside of the request will be the domain name it wants to resolve. Now, this request will get sent over to the DNS server, which means your computer must know the IP address of the DNS server. Now, once the server gets the request, it looks to see if it has an entry for the domain name in the request. If it does, it will generate a DNS response message or simply a DNS reply. Now, inside of the reply will be the IP address of the domain name that was in the request. Now, this gets sent back to your computer, and now it has the IP address of the domain name. It also adds this information in its local DNS cache as a DNS entry. So next time it needs to resolve the domain name, it doesn't need to consult the DNS server. Now, that is going to wrap up episode 1 of How Stuff Works. I really had a lot of fun, and I hope you learned a lot about DNS. Now, before we go, let's review everything that we discussed. Now, DNS stands for Domain Name System. It's a naming system computers use to map a domain name to an IP address. This will allow them to resolve the domain name to an IP address because it's the IP address they will need to communicate with the computer that owns that domain name. Now, to determine what IP address is mapped to the domain name, your computer will do what's known as a DNS lookup. First, it will look inside of its local DNS cache to see if it has an entry for the domain name. If it does, then great, it will know what IP address to use. When it doesn't, then it will have to reach out to a device on the network called the DNS server. To do this, it will generate a DNS request and send it to the server, which means your computer must know the IP address of the server. Now, if the server has an entry for that domain name, it will respond with the IP address of the domain name. Your computer will take this information and store it in its local DNS cache. So anytime it needs to resolve that domain name, it doesn't need to consult the DNS server. Now, if you found this video to be helpful, please like and share this video so we can get it in front of as many people as possible. You can also show your support by subscribing to the channel, as more videos on how stuff works will be released. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next episode.